Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on your time zone. And thank you for tuning in for the WorldFAIR project webinar that is presenting the project outputs. I'm Matti Heikkonen from the RDA. I'm filling in for Alex Delipalta, who is traveling today. So she's joining this meeting from the noisy dark corner of Heathrow. So we are not asking her to present. Today we are presenting updates on social surveys and the cultural heritage task of the project. But first, our usual housekeeping updates. So this webinar is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube channel and the project website. If you can post your questions in the chat during the presentations, we'll have a Q&A session after each of the presentations. This is part of the project webinar series, and there are still two webinars left in the schedule. So 20th of May, there's a geochemistry and disaster risk reduction webinar at 8 o'clock UTC. And then on 30th of May at 12 o'clock, population health one. And here is a link to the series, but I think this will also appear to the chat for your convenience, if not yet, very soon. So today's agenda. The first speaker is Steve McKeown, Director of the Australian Data Archive and Co-Data Officer. And he is reporting on the pilot testing, the harmonization workflows task. So in more detail, reporting the proof of concept implementation of the workflows used to trial the use of standardized workflows based on register services available at the Australian Data Archive and SIGT through their respective Collectica registries. And the second speaker today is Beth Nasuk, Project Manager for Research Data at the Digital Repository of Ireland. And she will be talking about a case study report on implementation and testing of the cultural heritage image sharing recommendations at the DRI. So in more detail, this is a report describing the use case for infrastructures that host image data for the cultural heritage sector, discussing implementation plan and current state of activities, and recording the decisions made towards realizing the 5 key recommendations. Before starting these presentations, one final advertisement. So then in the upcoming RDA virtual plenary, there are 2 sessions related to WorldFAIR project. So on 22nd of May, there's a selection of case studies that describe their works, their experience of using the FAIR implementation profiles and the recommendations based on this work. And then on 23rd May, there is a session focused on cross-domain interoperability framework. And here is the link to the sessions, but again, I think this will be on the chat for copy-pasting and clicking. So with this, I would like to ask Steve to take over and tell us about the pilot testing of the harmonization workflows. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matty. I will just pick up the screen share from here. And thanks everyone for joining us and for the opportunity to speak as well. I'm going to put in an apology now. I'm going to be speaking and then, as I say, some quick questions and then running. It is this evening, and I have a young family, so as I say, unfortunately, I have family responsibilities that have kicked in just at the wrong time. Or let's say at the time, so I will have to make an exit after a bit of a show and tell here. But as I say, I'm looking forward to talking a little bit about what we've done, and I will catch up on all the work that Beth's done, which you should be looking forward to as well. Okay, so I just bring the slides here, and I'll move into our display format. Okay, so yeah, so I'm the lead on work package 6 of the WorldFAIR project, the social surveys project. So I'm going to do a little bit of a recap for those who aren't familiar already with the work that the aim of this particular work package, what we were trying to do, and essentially the outputs that have come thus far, because they kind of lead into the third work deliverable and reporting on that as well. Before I start, I'm going to just acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, seas, and the waters, the areas that I live here in Australia, on the land of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people surrounding Canberra in Australia. And I'd like to acknowledge their continuing connection to their culture and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and future. And so The partners on this particular work package is the Australian Data Archive, which I lead, based at the Australian National University, and a group called the Centre for Social Research and Methods, and we're actually undergoing a name change at the moment to POLIS, which is the Social Policy Research Centre here in Australia. In Norway, we have SICT, formerly NSD, the Norwegian Agency for Shared Services in Education and Research as well. Now, we're involved in this work page because we essentially do quite similar things and are able to look at sort of coordination on methods and infrastructure in the social sciences to look at how we can do a better job of integration across national programs, in fact. So we're both involved in international social survey projects, including the European Social Survey, but also the International Social Survey Program and others. We both provide social science data archiving services. We both run social survey research projects. And we're also members of the DDI Alliance, that's the Data Documentation Initiative, involved in development of the DDI CDI standard and some of its predecessors as well. So there's a lot of cooperative and similar contexts that exist between the two organizations as well. And so really the intent of this particular work package is trying to see the extent to which we can facilitate interoperability within the social sciences domain to better leverage machine actionable systems and metadata as well. So what we were doing was a cooperative study of the data management harmonization integration practices of one of the satellite countries for the European Social Survey, which is Australia. We ran a parallel to the European Social Survey, which is an ERIC social science infrastructure, and look at how we go about harmonizing the data there, and look at whether we could develop a set of best practices which you could extend to other use in other related projects as well. We were examining administrative data and metadata management, technical environments, looking at really at the ecosystem where we have to bring both the technical and administrative together to manage data harmonization in the social sciences, and really trying to leverage particularly the DDI metadata standards, which both Hilda Rorten, who is the lead at SICT, and myself have a leadership role within that standards development organization as well, to first look at how they could use how multinational collections could be made increasingly interoperable using standard approaches, with the aim of setting a set of guidelines and tools for the development of cross-national collections into the future. In related areas in the WorldFAIR program, we have also a lot of data integration, cross-national data integration in the population health work package, and also in the urban health work package, and you might be interested in following up on those two work packages as well, to look at some of the comparative practices that have come out of the project. Ooh, sorry, I've ended up with a duplicate slide in there. So the intent of this particular project was really to dig into the nuts and bolts of the data integration and harmonization project, really picking the eyes out of the interoperability element of FAIR. In the social sciences, we tend to see, there's a lot of interest in data harmonization across countries in particular, but often across time as well. The intent being to be able to understand particular institutional and cultural differences and how they might impact upon and be impacted by public attitudes, public behaviour, public opinions. So there's often the conduct of a national survey as part of an international cooperative effort that's coordinated in various ways, and the harmonization efforts that we need to do to bring the collections together to compare outcomes between contexts, whether that's countries, time, a combination of the above. To say, three approaches. Either it's a designed in advance, an ex-ante approach, either through very strict input translation and adaptation, often using the same questionnaire, the same methodology, sampling and other things in the process. After the fact, the output harmonization, as it's called, collecting data using the same questions, but often with pre-designed recoding. So particularly where you have multinational surveys, dealing with things like, language differences, is just one starting point there. But often the types of ways we can collect data in countries might vary as well. So, but the intent is there to ask essentially the same set of questions, allowing for translation differences to feed into a coordinated framework using recoding. The third is essentially a harmonization out after the fact, where we have existing data, might have been done, for example, you might have heard of the Gallup poll, where they might run that in multiple countries, not intended to be harmonized from the start, but people want to bring together surveys that have asked similar questions in different times and different places, and see if they can bring them together effectively into an integrated database using a common definition. So we tend to fit our harmonization practices in this domain into those three basic types. And that's important for understanding essentially the sort of practices we need to put into place, which I'm going to come back to. There are some well-established metadata standards that support these. The two most prominent of these in the social sciences, the Statistical Data and Metadata Exchange, which is heavily used in the official statistics community for exchanging, essentially formalized data and metadata to build things like through the IMF or through the World Bank for exchanging data, and through the UN to build some of those multinational statistics into the UN Statistical Division, for example. The Data Documentation Initiative is often used more for what we call microdata, unit record data, answers of people to questions in a questionnaire at an individual level to enable some of the harmonization at that level as well. And the basic framework that exists within the DDI and that we leverage in this particular project is really aligned to what you see on screen here. Essentially, we've got three levels that we're interested in trying to coordinate: the conceptual, for example, marital status, where we have the idea of a marital status that doesn't have a representation as such, but we understand the idea, we understand the concept, and we're trying to describe that's the measurement aim that we're looking to integrate. Then we have what was called a represented level, where we have a specification of that as a question and a variable with a code representation, and then specifically how it appears in a given data set, whether that's in two different, the same collection in two different countries. Each of those collections in each country we would describe as what's called an instance variable, or a variable, a specification within a data set context within the data that's actually being collected. So we're trying to harmonize back to a common concept through a standardized representation from a set of instance collections that have actually occurred out in the field. And that's essentially the data collection harmonization process that we're trying to bring together. What that involves in practice is harmonization along quite a lot of different elements that might have been collected in the data collection process. I'm not going to dig into details here, but the sorts of things we're interested in include the variable itself, its representation, the categories that we used, the properties of the representation. It might be units of measurement, it might be the categories and codes that are used. Do you use M and F for male and female, single and married? Do you use 1 and 2, etc.? And how those values are actually encoded in the data set, what sort of data types you use, and so forth. And each of those, for practical purposes, for interoperability purposes, need to be considered in the process. So in our deliverable 6.2, we established essentially a workflow for this. It tried to bring together, it reviewed and both what we had been doing within ADA and SICT, and also best practice in some of the communities of practice that we were working within. So there's some degree of literature review, some review of existing practice to try and establish a framework that would provide a basis for us to really be able to establish, hopefully, a administrative and, if possible, a technical workflow that we can start building systems and if possible, but at least basic sets of workflows around in stages, and with those, each of those is kind of documented here. So the deliverable 6.2 was really focused on the 6 stages that you see on the screen established. This is the framework that we think is going to be viable. It tries to encapsulate current best practice. The purpose of then of deliverable 6.3 was to say, well, what happens if we actually try to implement that overall framework in practice? Let's work our way through each of those steps and apply it to a particular case study, and see how well those best practices hold up when you try to put them into the field. Now, our original intention, as I say, I'm going to talk a little bit about our case study. Our original intention was actually to use the next wave. We had previously reviewed European Social Survey Wave 10 and the collection in Australia, and we were expecting to be able to then repeat that with Wave 11 of the ESS and the Australian collection. Now, as it turned out, the data collection, in fact, hadn't been completed. In Australia, we had a referendum which substituted for the data collection that had been planned for the replication here, and the processing is still going on for the next wave of the European Social Survey as well. So as a result, we chose to use a very similar program, what's called the International Social Survey Program. It had the advantages of having very similar design properties. It was more output harmonization than input harmonization. It's not as closely controlled on the data collection methods that are used, but it has very similar ex-ante pre-designed properties in the process. We're both involved in the collection of it in Australia and Norway. And it does actually provide an interesting opportunity to allow us to test the best practices that we established from the ESS harmonization in a similar domain, to see how well they hold up when you transfer them to a slightly different, related, but slightly different context as well. So what I'm going to kind of work my way through here is what worked and what didn't, and kind of picking off each of the 6 steps in turn. Importing harmonization of the different elements we need to work our way through, working our way down that set of metadata that we really need to be able to work into to look at true interoperability, and then kind of providing some reflections at the end on, what worked, what didn't, and what do we think it kind of needs to be the next steps to kind of advance this as a way of sort of thinking about and implementing this sort of best practice model. So to kind of work our way through, let's say our framework kind of works with, essentially, let's say it's a very it's not a particularly complex process when we're thinking in practical terms, but it is a very from the point of view of interoperability, requires quite a heavy was quite a strong, heavy requirement on interoperability, and that's really where the process, needs probably some more uplift than we were able to achieve in the project itself. But what we did learn there, well, let's say starting with what's the first step that we're going through here? Well, we start with data import. What we're trying to do is sort of facilitate direct data and metadata access, ideally using API calls to our registry to be able to interact with it. Now, most of the repository systems that we use have pretty good interoperability there. So access to in our case, the ADA Dataverse repository, to be able to access the data was successful, and we can execute a call there. The challenge was really in the metadata itself. So some partial success here. The metadata itself was findable, it was accessible in a human readable format, it was reusable, and it had been reused in many countries. There was really strong documentation of the different parts of the metadata that we needed. The problem was, though, that essentially the metadata itself wasn't interoperable. It was essentially in document format rather than in a technical machine readable format. Depending on how you want to think about that, a lot of it was actually embedded inside a processing script, which could generate the relevant metadata, but it wasn't accessible directly, didn't have any sort of API access, and really wasn't exposed externally. Now, that was partly a function of the way the project's established, So we can, we can, and we actually were able to publish it to a test registry by generating the syntax from there. But if we're thinking really in terms of, full exposure and full interoperability, rethinking a little bit, how we expose that information probably needs some further thought. A lot of the effort in these programs, moving to stage 2, sits in terms of harmonization of concepts. So I working out the way in that pyramid that I referenced earlier. How well established was the set of concepts that the group was actually trying to measure, align, and then produce harmonized content for? Well, in point of fact, that because of the design of the project itself, that's very well established. The concept, what you're trying to do is just to detail the concepts that's being defined and measured, find the target content in the 2 countries or in the multiple countries that are looking to harmonize their content, and then establish the source content that will essentially allow you to populate that information from each country. Again, here we have it was fully documented in the project documentation, and it's, that's published on the ISSP website, but it's not published in a form in an external registry, which allows it to be processed or automatically. A lot of it has to be, read, generated, and reproduced by the project teams locally. It was possible to generate the target variables from the syntax script that the GASIS team provide, and then that was able to be generated and ingested into a Collectica registry. Collectica being one of the DDI compliant registry services, which both SICT and ADA use. And that was able to establish, sort of a test registry, which we were able to use. Once that was there, the source content, and we used just the Australia to the target template instance. There is often a one-to-one correspondence from source to target that we were able to essentially harmonize, in a relatively straightforward way. There's a pretty clear matching because of the way the project design is actually implemented ex ante. So, for example, we were able to generate, this is a screenshot of the Collectica sample register we established within our testing systems here at ADA. We were able to essentially build straight off the shell data file that's produced by the documentation that we had, the test script that we had, and populate a registry from that. But this wasn't available automatically. Also, there were some questions that then about how to access that through API-based methods as well, which start to put some challenges on, particularly in terms of timeframes, in terms of building essentially authentication and access systems into these. But we could build the registry, we could populate the registry, so it should be possible to make metadata like this available effectively. There's the list of variables that we have, and here's a quite detailed referenceable set of content that could be used to build a semi-automated system. The next stage in the process, and I'm moving our way through, the variable names. So we work our way through. We've got to locate the data, identify the concepts we want to harmonize, then target the specific variables, or essentially columns in a data set that we're interested in processing. Because we've got a spelling error in there, sorry. This is something that can be generated fairly automatically in most statistical packages used in the social sciences. We were able to sort of simulate that fairly easily by generating a content list in Excel and just using concatenations, but you could automatically generate it from a concordance file, which is used to import the content into the Collectica registry as well. So that should be a fairly straightforward thing to do once the data is available, the metadata is available effectively in a content registry. The lookups and generating transformation scripts was a straightforward process. The challenging part, though, then falls when you start having to think about harmonizing what we call codes and categories, or the numbers and or letters that appear in the cells in a table, and the labels that might be associated with those. So, M for male, F for female, or in our marital status case, single, divorced, married, etc. What you're trying to do there is match the codes and categories that are used in the target and your target destination data set with the content that's in your source variables that are in the instance data sets that you have been produced by your countries, and then also align what we call the substantive content and the what's called sentinel content that requires understanding of where the data is. Sorry, where information is that is not reflective of the substantive content you're interested in. So someone's marital status, but rather was the data missing? Was it someone refused to answer? Was it that there was a spelling error? Was it that there was a missing content for some reason? So these what we call in DDI sentinel values, and the way they're managed can vary quite a lot as well, and often is to do with decisions that are made by the processing teams. So two core challenges in facilitating interoperability here is what we found in the harmonization process. Very big differences in missing and sentinel values between different data formats, whether that's over time, same team working in two different time zones, or working between two different countries. Small choices that they make, even things like data type encoding, can result in mismatches that occur. Do you use capitals or lower cases? So these small variations make it very difficult to automate a process. We did, though, manage to sort of establish a pilot to start streamlining this that read from that sample collector registry and started to do some automated matching of the content to try and streamline this process. So it should be possible with a bit of further effort to do an improved job of matching codes and categories. The key thing here is actually matching the categories. Married is married, divorced is divorced, single is single. But say be able to match those up effectively using some AI support there. Early tests had it finding some rather making some rather poor mistakes. We were using essentially text matching, try and match up categories, which varied in its success. But I think with a bit of supervised learning, we should be able to achieve quite a bit with that, which sort of promotes the value of the having that external registry to read in and then match the content. The fifth type, as part of the process, we didn't actually get time to get to this in the end, the data type harmonization. So aligning the data types, encoding, there's character encoding, whether it's a integers, character types, seeing be able to harmonize those and have an interaction with those effectively. We didn't really have time to sort of complete that due to time constraints, but that would be an important part of the process as well. The last stage, though, that's sort of highlighted in the documentation in the harmonization workflow, is really capturing what has been done in the harmonization process. There's a lot of human decision making, and in theory, there's also a lot of potentially machine-based decision making that could be used to support this process. But for a secondary user to be able to use it, you need to have that information accessible as to what the choices that have been made. To some extent, that's produced by software scripts and external registries, which produce in themselves artifacts, and you could generate logs, out of that document the process for you. So we think that could be further in, we generated those sorts of artifacts, and they've included in the, as appendices to the report. We think that could be further enhanced though through some automated generation of log outputs in scripting and automation tools. So to essentially generate the choices that are made. If you're deciding on a, that A equals B, or M in one data set equals M in another data set, That's essentially a choice that gets encoded in a script. If you can think about the logging of that, that could be, you could build certainly some of that code level and category level decision making to be automated out of the scripting process. We actually went to the point of actually building a pilot harmonization tool, which was able to generate essentially a decision making table. We even get the machine learning algorithm to generate the basis on which it had decided on a potential match between codes in categories. And sort of an example here that appears on the screen. This is our harmonization tool. It went through and said, am I matching on the basis of the same name, similar name, similar code, etc. And each of these, essentially, it was it's going through and recording what it's done with the application of the matching of a particular category and the decision that's made on that basis. And you can say you could do that automatically, and this was generated by the machine learning tool, but you could also have a manual process for selecting those as well, based upon coding scripts that you have in place. So the output of all of that, we're sort of coming to summarize where we got to. This was our overall process. How well did it reflect and how well did it work in practices in terms of sort of reflecting the harmonization process that we tend to use in harmonizing surveys? And again, we were taking this from the European Social Survey, applying it to the International Social Survey Program. Did it translate particularly across? Well, we had sort of mixed success. None of the overall, and there's a legend at the bottom there, kind of indicating on what worked and what didn't, and what might need some improvement here. The import-export, the document harmonization processes were mixed successes. Accessing systems, interacting with machine to machine with systems proved to be actually quite a challenge, and so we had to simulate some of the registry services and the data access services that were there, because actually establishing communications between multiple systems was going to be a challenge in and of itself, which is not always might be a bit more resource intensive than we're used to. The concept, the process itself on the harmonization of the concepts, the variable names, and the variable codes and labels seemed a pretty good reflection of actual practice, and we were able to generate some sample content there that pretty accurately reflects the process that we would go through. The exception there was really in establishing target variables. What we mean by that is the template that we had from the ISSP. What we didn't have was that in machine actionable form, so we had to simulate that ourselves in our own registry and draw that out of the documentation, where preferably that would be available as an existing registry. So most of the stages in the process seem to work pretty well, and we think this is a way forward for sort of coordinating on survey and social science data harmonization. None of the processes were didn't work. The one we didn't get to was the data type harmonization, which there's more effort to be involved in, but I think we can kind of pick that up going forward. Some basic recommendations that came out of this, though, this kind of it has been alluded to already. Standardized access controls for access to both data and metadata registries, partly to limit the need for less technical users to navigate access control systems. We had some challenges, for example, in interacting with either the registries weren't there, or were they going to be accessible using through API-based methods. That's not insurmountable, of course, but how do we expose the registries in such a way that they limit the need for having to think about a lot of the API keys and because it's supposed to be public metadata anyway. How do we facilitate that access effectively? Along with that, establishing a code repository for interaction with these metadata repositories. Both ADA and SICT used the Collectica system. We would like to be able to sort of establish a repository that allows us to use the same methods to access both of those systems. Trying to make sure that we have mechanisms for reuse of conceptual variables and those concept systems across the DDI standards ecosystem. This is really a recommendation for the DDI Alliance. For example, what we weren't able to do was actually take a concept variable literally from the registry at SICT and be able to reuse inside the ADA systems. Now, that's a question of how do you reference and ensure that you have within your standard the capacity to reuse the metadata, not just in simple terms. I can always copy paste. I can always read the metadata across. But what I actually would prefer to do is say this is the same thing. So how do we use those sort of external referencing systems to be able to effectively recognize concepts that exist across countries, that across the projects that we're talking about here, and then standardized practices and code libraries for the creation of resources for external reuse. If we can establish the framework we want to use for that concept reuse, then we want the code libraries that allow us to actually put that into practice to facilitate the reuse that we're talking about here in those recommendations. So that was kind of an overview of where we got to. So the report's now available. I'd say what we can say is we've got our workflow that's kind of our harmonization framework that's kind of established in deliverable 2. Some success, then we'll be keen to work further on that going forward. But as an evaluation, we've got I think a good framework for moving forward, and now it's a chance to look at how we apply it in related domains.
Okay, thank you very much, Steve. It's very interesting. Do we have any questions? I don't see anything on the chat. So I had a couple of things that came to my mind, because you're basically working with the European cross-national initiative, and then Australia has its own federated structure. So did you encounter issues stemming from the fact that the use cases might be different for these social survey data? I mean, was it something that you noticed?
It's the case study itself, and in fact both case studies were kind of selected on the basis they kind of were designed in advance to work together. So the use cases we knew going in, we didn't have to deal with the huge variations of the use case. That was we took advantage of the fact that, let's say, there was that international cooperation already in place. It's not to say, and I kind of reflected on those harmonization alternatives that were there. Some of the we're dealing ones with designed in advance to work together, and that made life easier. But you would certainly face the case where in a different dealing with a different context. The one we didn't for example have a look at was just language differences. Both of these, it was Norwegian integration, but they're designed in English, which is advantageous for me not speaking Norwegian as a starting point there. But even just those simple differences in starting to think about language comparisons even within the same project. I say we because we knew in advance those problems that had already kind of been dealt with in those projects, we didn't have to deal with that as much. But the next part of that would certainly have to think about, well, what happens when you deal with those sorts of variations.
Okay. Any other questions? I think the other thing I had in mind, because you mentioned these sort of data formats and so on, and do you have sort of examples of, let's say worst case scenarios? How much time did you end up spending on things that people were kind of assuming that this is always the way you do things, but they just sort of clashed?
We kind of actually sort of worked through a little bit of that in the previous deliverable, in fact. Where, as I say, where you can see it could be a really quite a big time sink. And this, as I said, the simplest example I kind of referred to there was the things like capitalization, minor variations in spelling, the use of accents on characters. You know, as the part of the point of the exercise was to look at how we can essentially speed things up by using essentially automated processing. Those minuscule differences, or just, some of them are, genuine differences, but some of them are just, encoding differences can make, and I kind of referenced in this presentation as well, those sentinel values, how you deal with what designates a missing case or a missing value in your data set, can create all sorts of havoc. Particularly if you're dealing with, they've come from different source software, or different encodings. So we actually have a recommendation in there to stop dealing with any of those things as missing, for example, and to have a designation for them that is a formal, that doesn't rely upon some sort of software encoding, because that actually gets quite heavily in the way of trying to automate what should be a relatively simple thing. This is missing, but if I go for the R package of Python or Excel, they all deal with these things in very different ways, and that can make life quite hard.
Okay, thank you very much. If there are no other questions, I think, thank you very much. It's a very interesting presentation. I think, in a way, if you think about combining social survey data, I think going through the slide deck and reflecting on it probably will save lots of time. I think that would be my take home there. So I think with this, I would really like to thank you and let you go and continue your VIP hosting duties.
Yes, I've got to go prepared for bedtime. So thanks, and good luck. Thanks. Good luck to bed.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So next, I would like to ask Beth to take over and tell us about the implementation and testing of the cultural heritage image sharing recommendations.
All right, that's a tough act to follow. I always get stuck behind Steve, and he gives all this interesting detail of this like national level work of harmonization. And then I get to come and talk about the Digital Repository of Ireland, working with cultural heritage in a field that has been doing, I think, a lot of this harmonization work for many, many years. So we're benefiting off of work that is kind of only starting to happen in social surveys. So you see the root of all the work that had to happen to get me to where I am today, to be able to talk to you about the little tweaks ultimately that we did to the Digital Repository of Ireland in order to respond to our WorldFAIR recommendations. So having now undersold myself, I need to back it back up and say that Digital Repository of Ireland is leading the work package in cultural heritage because we are Ireland's national repository for the arts, social sciences, and humanities data. I'm sorry, I'm going to just take a second. I've got things all over my screen. Okay, there we go. Hide some stuff on me. So we're Ireland's national repository for the arts, social sciences, and humanities data. We have a mix of data coming from the GLAM sector, which I'll refer to as galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. That's kind of the cultural heritage piece, as well as research data that comes from, like I said, the humanities and the social sciences. So we have kind of an interesting overlap and mix of cultural heritage collections being represented alongside research data, and that has informed, from its inception, how the Digital Repository of Ireland has looked to kind of embrace and commingle practices that are informed by research data and are also informed by cultural heritage best practices. We're already kind of a bit of a mix of practices. We were an early adopter of the FAIR principles for research data, and participating in WorldFAIR gave us an opportunity to kind of check our understanding of how we'd mix these practices together and review our specific applications. So it's a little bit selfish, maybe, participating in WorldFAIR, but it also gave us a platform to champion this approach across related domains of practice. If we sort of reviewed what we were doing within a wider context and said, actually, we think this is what others should be doing, or this can be a use case for what others could be doing, then that would help to benefit cultural heritage practice as a whole. So how did we get here? We are on our third deliverable now that I'm talking to you about, but I'll back it up and tell you about the previous two deliverables that got us to where we're at. So we produced 3 deliverables over the course of the project, focused on specifically sharing images in the cultural heritage domain. And we picked image sharing because that's something that a lot of organizations like archives, libraries, and museums have already established some practice around. There is exchange through platforms like the platforms you see represented in the slide here. The Digital New Zealand, Digital Public Library of America, Europeana, these are primarily image exchange platforms, which pull from archival images and museum images, library images, which are all cataloged and organized and envisioned around different frameworks and standards and metadata standards. So in our first deliverable, we decided we needed to review policy and practice guidance championed by leading professional associations which govern GLAM practice internationally, like the International Council on Archives, the International Federation of Library Associations, International Council of Museums, and I think we threw in OCLC and the Society of American Archivists as well, just because they have a lot of really good documentation. We also reviewed 6 image sharing platforms, which you're seeing here on the screen, that supported the exchange of image data across these sectors. So we looked at the policies that generated digital images within the GLAM sector, and then we looked at the delivery platforms for exchanging information about these images and put together a summary, policies and practices report, a landscaping report, as it were. It helped us to see where the Digital Repository of Ireland was situated specifically within cultural heritage practice. And the end of that report, we do have a little bit of a review of kind of how we see ourselves aligned specifically with cultural heritage. That helped us go into the next deliverable, where we put together a working group of collections managers, librarians, archivists, researchers, IT professionals, and policymakers from around the world to help us to review the landscape report, to put it into context with the FAIR principles for research data, and make recommendations where we thought generally the GLAM sector could better support FAIR. How digital images are presented for citations. These are the recommendations that we ultimately came up with. Transparency around the management of digital files and their metadata, the amount of administrative information that is made publicly accessible about the provenance and the way that digital collections are put together, ways to overcome challenges in clarity around licensing and rights specifically. That was a hot topic in the interest in the working group. And finally, how materials are able to be accessed, queried, and reused at scale. So these recommendations that came out in our second report are generally applicable to practices in the cultural heritage sector. Again, we took that policies and practices report, we talked about the FAIR principles, we talked about what was missing, we talked about what we could do to better support research and computational reuse at scale of cultural heritage images. And these are the 5 key recommendations that we sort of coalesced around and decided were areas where the GLAM sector strategically could improve what is already a really great system for sharing images. As I mentioned, the metadata exchange is already something that has happened in that field. So the kind of work that Steve's talking about is we already have like the structure there to support that. And what we're looking now is kind of like the icing on the cake. What could we do just like a little bit better? So we published those results from the second report in May of 2023, which means over the last year, we have talked at DRI about how we would specifically implement those recommendations or what those recommendations might mean for us in our particular use case. Now, as I introduced at the start of this presentation, DRI was kind of already focused on supporting the FAIR principles. It's something that we already worked into our practice. So we kind of looked at some of these recommendations and thought this is going to be a bit of a challenge because we feel like we're already supporting some of these recommendations. And some of the conversations that came out and the results that come out in the slides that follow are really focused on, well, can we be doing a little bit better? What can we do a bit better? And we got to March of 2024, where we put out deliverable number 3, which I'm talking about, which is the decisions that we made. So the first one that we looked at was the citation model. And one of the reasons why we had a recommendation for a citation model in the first place is that not all image sharing platforms and not all GLAM institutions put forward a recommended method of citing the materials that they share. Oftentimes there's sort of a suggestion in the right statement, you know, if you're going to reuse this, please say courtesy of the museum. But oftentimes it's just not really addressed at all. There isn't an easy clickable mechanism or for a researcher to reuse something and know confidently that they have cited it correctly so that it's clear where this material came from. So DRI already had an auto citation generator in the repository. So we had this function where on any of the images or any of the collections, you could click a button and download a citation that would give you the DOI, that would give you information about who deposited it and what the title of the resource was, which we believe encourages researchers to accurately cite the resources. The way we formatted the citations, though, didn't answer any of the questions that you see on the left here. The citations were designed for research data. They were designed for bibliographic use. And we did actually, you could select a DRI citation, or you could select MLA, APA, and I think Chicago as well were the other citation formats that we supported that would rearrange bits of metadata into different formats so that you could use them appropriately in bibliographies. But the bibliographic models favored citations back to the original object. They kind of favored the original creator, the original date. And yet we knew that what was being used in computational research in particular was not that original object. It was going to be the metadata and the data that was derived from the digital representation. Therefore, citing the specific expression of the original object would be important. So if we were trying to answer questions about who do you cite with a citation that used a 19th century depositor as the lead in the citation, we're kind of suggesting to researchers to ignore the importance of the fact that the way that object has been described was supplied by the museum. The metadata that you're actually using and crunching your numbers on or performing your calculations was supplied by the depositor, was supplied by an institution that is framing that object in a particular way, that has created their metadata for a particular audience, and maybe has digitized the resource again to suit a particular audience or constrained by particular finances or expertise in the department that can influence how the image turns out, how that image is represented. So we wanted to answer questions of who do you cite? We wanted to put the organization or the depositor first. That is the person or the organization that you're citing, is whoever created the digital resource. What type of resource is it? We wanted to flag, in fact, that you were citing an image. We use DCMI type vocabulary for most of our type metadata. What do you need to know about it? Well, we did kind of still want to embed something about the original creator within that citation. We didn't want to erase the fact that most researchers were still looking for information about that original name. They're probably talking about the original object, perhaps in their paper, whatever it is that they're using to cite. So we wanted to make sure that that was still embedded within the citation. So there's information about that historical creator and what they titled it and maybe the original date that an original object was created. And then has the data about the object changed? Well, we understand that cultural heritage records persist over time. They last, and they're intended to last. And that means that they sometimes get updated. And we wanted to really flag that. So although DOIs can indicate when things have been updated, we wanted to make sure that the researcher was putting that into their references, into their citations, that they were accessing these objects at particular dates and times. And I'm aware that it's actually noon now, so I'm hopeful that I can get through the next couple of slides fairly quickly, and still maybe some of you can hang around for questions. Our next result that we worked on, our next recommendation, was transparency. So in order to encourage transparency, we thought we needed to know more about how our members and depositors were creating digital images in the first place. So our recommendation was to be more transparent about where digital images come from and how you interact with them and how you've edited them and what produced them in the first place. And because we're not the producers, we're the repository that hosts the images, we needed to know what was going on so that we could better support our depositors. So what we did for this recommendation was to produce a survey. The survey was open for 2 months. It ran from December 2023 to January 2024. We did have about 20 submissions, which is a 35% response rate for DRI, since we only have 60 members in the first place. And we did get representation from across archives, research, public community archives, libraries, research and public, and museums and higher education institutions. We have a wide variety, we have a wide scope for membership. We allowed depositors and us to compare the information from embedded metadata with the descriptive metadata, and answer questions like, what kind of equipment do depositors use? Do they embed copyright statements or other metadata in their digital objects, which are things that could be communicated or exposed, or that maybe should be encouraged in order to travel with those objects? Which version of the digital object is shared through the repository? We found out very interestingly that a lot of depositors create original sort of archival images that we might think of as the largest size capture, then edit it a little bit and deposit that with us. So there's sort of, we're just getting the end of a workflow maybe rather than the start of a workflow as well. So we could encourage them to also deposit those original raw scans, or to be more transparent about the processes that they undergo for editing, because almost all of them do a little bit of editing. One of the things that has come of this survey, and is something that has not been fully implemented yet, but will be going forward, is that we will expose the metadata that is embedded within the images to the depositor at the time of deposit, in order to allow them, like, they basically get a report on what their own digital images are telling them. And they will then be able to use that in their description if they want to make that transparent. All right, and then recommendation number 3, data documentation. So again, DRI already had support for depositors to include related documentation with their deposits. But I would say that very few organizations kind of make use of this additional documentation feature, and it's really open to the depositor to decide what is relevant and what is useful, what constitutes additional documentation. And we noted in our second deliverable that there was a trend towards standardizing descriptions of scope and provenance, which were culminating in things like data sheets, which could be very useful to recommend to depositors to include using this add documentation feature that was already available in the repository. It just so happened a Europeana working group published a recommendation on data sheets for digital cultural heritage in the fall of 2023. And we've decided to adopt that as a recommendation for depositors, to suggest that they may want to consider filling out a data sheet to accompany future deposits. And data sheets can answer questions like, what is included in this data and how is it collected? It gives a sense of where there might be things that are missing and what you might want to account for if you are looking at what you perceive to be a complete collection that is, you know, for those of us who work in the cultural heritage field, never actually complete, but it is representative of a research question essentially, or a collecting mandate. And understanding that can really help you to understand where those gaps might be and what this collection, the answers that this collection can and cannot answer. What relationships are there to other data sets, documents, or resources? This can help to encourage people to do more cross-linking with their papers. As the approach to the data changed over time, you can update these data sheets. And actually, it's encouraged as good practice to update these data sheets as you make changes or as you make additions or as you revise the descriptions or the metadata. What is a good example of how the data may be reused? One of the things the data sheets interestingly asks for is examples of reuse, which can really help researchers to understand, again, the kinds of questions that these collections can be put to, like how they can use them. I do have a plug here down at the bottom of the slide for our upcoming DPASH conference, which is Digital Preservation in the Arts, Social Sciences, and Humanities, that is going to be hosted at the University of Limerick and Hunt Museum this coming June, end of June. And we have a workshop that is focused on using specifically this data sheet for digital cultural heritage that we're very excited to be able to host. If you're curious about data sheets, you can make it out to Limerick. We invite you to do so. Recommendation number 4 on licensing and rights. So once again, DRI already encouraged and actually required depositors to license their material. We supported the use of either CC0 or CC BY licensing for metadata in the repository, but we actually realized in reviewing that we didn't tell our depositors that in very many places, or that we didn't make necessarily clear when a depositor had made a decision one way or the other, if they preferred CC0 or CC BY. And we really wanted to advocate actually for CC0 metadata across the board. When you aggregate to platforms like Europeana, it is actually required for us to submit it as CC0. And so we wanted to flatten across the board, encourage our depositors to choose the CC0 license. And so we applied a metadata license that now appears in all of the records that will either show CC0, or I think the statement actually says it's a license of CC0 unless otherwise indicated, unless you see a CC BY. So that just makes clearer that the digital asset, while sometimes restricted, the metadata about it, the description about it is usually not. We found that in the cultural heritage sector, licenses are generally not used, or they were used in image sharing platforms, again, only to refer to kind of the digital asset. It wasn't always clear if the metadata had a license at all, or what that metadata was, if it differed from the license that might have been applied to the object. We've tried to make that clear here. The metadata is licensed separately from the object, which might be restricted in use, but the metadata is not. We did also want to standardize how depositors expressed information about rights, because rights are really important for cultural heritage. In a lot of cases, the institutions are not the creators of the data, and so sometimes they're in a position where they don't really have the right to use a CC0 license, which is designed for creators, but they can apply rights. They can apply rights that make clear when educational use is permitted, for instance. So we adopted a series of standardized statements that are provided by Rights Statements. You go to rightstatements.org, you can find their complete list of statements, which is put in addition to a free text rights field that still allows depositors to add their own nuance and extra information, but also provides a machine actionable rights statement to accompany licenses and the metadata license. I know it's kind of difficult to see in this slide here, but the rights that do appear above the metadata license that I've highlighted in the screenshot, like you can see how much of a paragraph that is. That's quite a lot of information, which could be neatly summed up in a little copyright educational use permitted flag or some such from rightstatements.org. So this licensing and rights is meant to answer questions such as, is the metadata license separately from the data? Can the rights information be made machine actionable? Can we limit the scope of possible expressions of rights and licenses to ensure a more reliable and understandable use? And I am coming to the end now. This is our recommendation number 5 for delivery. So if we go all the way back to D13.1, our first deliverable, I said that we reviewed how DRI fit within what was common in the cultural heritage domain, but we also pointed out, I think, a little bit where we were going above and beyond. In the cultural heritage domain, it is common for a lot of information metadata to be exposed via an OAA PMH feed for metadata harvesting. And then there's a lot of, sorry, I've got a little bit of a messy statement here. We use an API. There are APIs that were associated with a bunch of the image sharing platforms that we looked at, but we do use an API available for developers wishing to interact with the metadata in the repository, which gives them a lot more freedom than just using the search box that's in the repository web interface. BOIs are issued for every collection and every object record through DataCite, which is kind of going above and beyond the persistent identifier, the persistent URLs that are usually used within the cultural heritage domain. For image files specifically, end users are able to view both IIIF manifests as well with IIIF viewer and the underlying RDF directly from the object page. And very recently, again, this past fall, we implemented something called FAIR signposting, which just sort of marks up all of our web metadata records so that they're more machine actionable and understandable to what Murillo has called the scholarly web. And I like that expression. So we've done a lot to try and expose our information, and it was questionable like where we could go that would be interesting or needed or better. And we thought we need to go back to our users and create some use cases for the repository. This is the best way forward, is to just ask our users how all the stuff we're already using is working. So what do users want to be able to do with data in the repository? How well do the existing tools work? API, our Baget export, our IIIF implementation. How do we track usage and reuse examples to encourage better engagement with datasets in the future? And once again, I'm pointing back to our DPASH conference because we have a data exploration event that is being hosted at the University of Limerick this coming May by my colleague Joan, who is on the call. And we'll be showcasing the results from the use cases that are generated from that at our upcoming DPASH conference. So this is just a recap of what it is that DRI did to respond to the recommendations that we produced. One was to create a new citation style to better represent digital cultural heritage data. The next was to survey our membership about digitization practices and develop guidelines for utilizing embedded metadata and documenting file creation and management practices. Then we decided to enhance DRI's existing guidance on providing contextual information, because we do encourage that, but specifically with a datasheet template that was developed for purpose by people who have been thinking about this far longer than I have with the Europeana Working Group's datasheets for digital cultural heritage datasets. We decided to add rights statements to encourage standardized rights language within our records, and we added a metadata statement to the record page to make clear that the data and metadata may be licensed separately. And then the delivery, develop use cases to support further technical developments. So that one's kind of up in the air, but I'm really interested to see what comes from our data exploration event. If you have any further questions, you can read all about our work package on the WorldFAIR Project's website. And that's it for me.
Okay, thank you very much, Beth. I think this was a great example of doing expectation management when it's not needed. So thank you.
Thanks, Maddie.
So well, we are a little bit over time. I think we had a couple of questions there, but I think Karen's comment or sort of statement actually sounded like I don't know if you would like to give a little bit more detail about your sort of applying the lessons learned. Can I try to unmute?
All right. Karen was on our working group. She was one of the members who participated in developing the recommendations in the first place. So I can imagine that she's asked a very very specific and intelligent question, but I actually don't see where what her question is exactly.
So it was basically sort of.
Oh, sorry, I see it in the chat now.
Yeah.
Sorry, cultural heritage recommended it, and the word inspired us at the University of Haifa. So we are in the process of, yes, I'm aware that specifically around copyright and licensing, I think Karen has done quite a bit of work. And I don't know if you want to share as well, Karen?
Okay, I don't know.
Karen's saying her microphone is unworking.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
shoot.
Okay. So then we need to return to, I think, this discussion about the image format that was quite interesting in a way. I think, like you said, if you have an image, there's always the processing behind it. If you have a JPEG and so on, and I think this looks like something that could be of interest, sort of future work. So yeah, I think, did we have any other questions in the chat? I think one thing I had in mind, because you mentioned that DRI is a mature repository. So do you have sort of guesstimate or estimate in a way that if you start from something like Core Trust Seal certified repository, then applying these 5 recommendations, how much extra effort we are talking about, or extra investment?
Oh, that's a really good question, because I did not anticipate the level of effort it would require. And it's interesting that you mentioned Core Trust Seal right there, because one of the things that we had to be mindful of when we were going in to make changes was that we do have our recertification upcoming, which means that any changes we make, we have to also be mindful of their impact on statements we make about how we encourage data quality, for instance, data curation, preservation as part of our Core Trust Seal certifications. There's lots of that. I think there's a review very early on of the Core Trust Seal recommendations to make sure that any changes would not affect how we represented ourselves, or that we were prepared for that when we went through the process, which we're going through right now. Also, we serve the social sciences. So there was a lot of back and forth between, well, don't do things that are specific for cultural heritage that don't work for the social sciences, because we have one interface. We didn't create 2 different metadata inputs. It's all Dublin Core. And like if you come to our repository, if it's cultural heritage or if it's social sciences data, it's the same form. It's like it's all information that's been integrated. And so we didn't want anything that we did as part of the WorldFAIR project to de-integrate, to kind of make cultural heritage special or different. We wanted actually for it to interoperate, for it to continue to function as data that was exchangeable and therefore understandable with other types of disciplinary data. So one of the big questions, one of the things that took the longest to work on, was the development of a new citation style. We didn't want to overwrite the existing citation style, which worked very well for humanities data and social sciences data. It was designed to be a data citation style. But we recognized that in using that citation style for cultural heritage, it was sort of making it more difficult to recognize who is actually being cited in that citation. It is the institution that's provided the original records, the institution that's provided the metadata, that created the digital image, that is influencing then your interpretation of that original object by presenting you with the data you need to interpret it. We wanted to make sure that we did capture that, and so it resulted in now a toggle where if you are looking at cultural heritage records and you want to use the cultural heritage style, you have to flip from the standard DRI style and select cultural heritage as something that's different. So that was a lot of work to get to that point. And Joan could honestly probably talk a lot more about that, but I don't know if she wants to, because I think she pulled half her hair out doing it.
Okay, but in a nutshell, basically, yeah, you shouldn't underestimate the effort needed. But of course, Core Trust Seal provides, or other sort of maturity models, they provide you certain foundations that then maybe help this. You have prepared for this organizational change that John mentioned in the chat, that you have already done some of it. So you have, you know, who to talk to, and the process of related to governance funding and so on that you may need to look into. So yeah. Do we have any last minute questions, comments, success stories?
Should I ask some question?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. So thanks for the presentation. So I just have two questions. The first one is for the citation. As we know that maybe some digital objects maybe have no DOI identifiers. So people sometimes make the citation for the UIR, but sometimes they just make mention of the which part or which object they cite, and maybe no DOI and no UIR. So how to track the data use for the object? That's the first question. And the second one is how to map or how to integrate the metadata between social science and natural science. As we know that for like in the museum or some herbarium, there are so many specimens for plant or animals. So many of the data are just shared by GBIF, Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So what I want to ask is that maybe some data may be stored in the local database of the museum or herbarium, but in natural science, they may need more information. So some maybe from the social science, they may need less information. So I wonder how to balance the need between different descriptions. Thank you.
That's a really good question, and actually quite timely for us here at DRI, because we just accepted a large biodiversity collection, where we will be working with a partner who's depositing, what is it? It's our national, I don't want to get the name wrong, but National Biodiversity something.
National
Botanical Gardens. Botanical Gardens. So they have information about botanical specimens, biodiversity that doesn't necessarily fit in your metadata standards for cultural heritage. The way we've handled that in the past and the way we're aiming to handle it in the future at DRI is that we allow for the import of a variety of very rich and granular metadata standards that map to our Dublin core record, but not everything necessarily maps into the record. And so you can click to view the expanded metadata and you'll see the original record represented in the original metadata standard. So we take kind of like the easy parts to map and migrate. So it would be things like title or description or the keywords that are going to be kind of common across systems. And then we allow users who need that more specific representation of the data to view the expanded metadata. I don't know that that's a perfect system, but that has worked very well for us so far, especially in terms of allowing depositors to import using whatever system they were using beforehand, rather than trying to recatalog the data just to fit our system. We do a little bit of mapping. Your other question about the use of citing specific images, but not necessarily having DOIs. We're a bit lucky at DRI in that we do assign DOIs to individual images. So when you get our citation, you're going to get a DOI that references that specific image. It is possible to use the collection level citation. And again, our collections also have DOIs, so you have that reference there in the citation for the collection. And then it would be on the researcher to try and clarify that there's like a subset of the collection that they used. But interestingly, I think there's a Research Data Alliance working group that is talking about subsetting and sampling citations of parts of collections, that is dealing with this more from the sciences perspective, but talking about how do you do that accurately so that you don't need a DOI for every little thing. And I do recognize that probably a lot in the cultural heritage field don't assign a DOI to every individual object.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joan. She's put a link in the chat for the RDA working group.
Okay. Being somewhat mindful of the time, I think we are 25 minutes over, so I think it seems like we could continue quite a while. I think maybe just to do a little bit of injustice for the 20th May webinar, but I would just sort of follow this discussion. So just to flag the 23rd May the cross-domain interoperability framework session, which actually sounds a little bit like could be one of those places to continue discussion about how you reuse the data across natural sciences and cultural heritage and so on. So, but with that, I think it's time to thank both of our speakers and the audience for active participation and maybe close the meeting this time around. But thank you, Beth, very much, and looking forward to seeing you on the 20th.
Thanks, Matty. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.